I want to address today the global order, so the globalization process, viewed from the point of view of the developing world. So my focus will be on what are let's say the opportunities and the challenges, and particularly, as we will see throughout the lecture, some of the major institutional issues that relate, let's say, to the way developing countries fit in the global order. Now, viewed from that perspective, I may start by saying that, in a sense, we have lived through two opposite views of this question of development. The traditional view, which goes back to, let's say, to David Ricardo, which views, in a sense, the international economy as a system in which equal partners relate to each other and specialize according to their comparative advantage, as the traditional theory goes. Now, there are, in a sense, many versions of that. And you could even say that the very popular book by Thomas Friedman, The World is Flat, is a sort of a view of that sort. And the opposite view, which is to a large extent the one that I'm going to present today, is rather the view of the international system really as a hierarchical system, as a system in which unequal partners relate to each other, and which, of course, from that perspective poses very specific challenges to the design of the architecture. So, viewed from that point of view, I would like to start by introducing, in a sense, the three critical issues, try to interpret some of the results that I will present, and then go back to the institutional arrangements and try to see from the point of view of the design of international institutions, but also from the point of view of the specific issues that relate to the international agenda, how we can see this issue of the management of the interlinks between the developing countries and the global order. So I will start by presenting some facts that relate to to the three, what I call the three critical issues in the international economic order. The first one is that markets are very unevenly liberalized. We'll see through the comparison of different periods in history what I am talking about. The second is the one which I will dwell in for a bit longer in this initial part of the presentation, is that the benefits of the globalization process are very unevenly distributed, both among nations and among citizens. And I would say that to a large extent, these outcomes relate to a third critical issue, which is the fact that there is a significant lag in the development of the global institutions to manage global markets. And in a sense, in that regard, we are leaving some of the issues that were faced by many nations, most earlier in history, before the rise of the state institutions to market the effects of markets, for instance, the development of the social welfare state, or the development of the market regulation in different forms, which were the ways by which particularly the industrial economies were able to manage some of the downsides of markets. That early state in which these institutions were not developed generated many difficulties, both economic and social, which were faced by the rise of state institutions. Well, at the global level, we are seeing that stage, because we haven't we don't have now the sort of institutions that are required to manage the downsides of global markets. Now, when I talk about these institutional issues, may I say that I am, in a sense, referring to at least 5 difficult questions. The first, and I will go back at the end of my lecture in particular to this issue, that we have an incomplete and biased agenda. But aside from that, may I say, we have also an incomplete set of institutions. There are areas of the international system which lack institutions. And even when we have institutions, there is a significant, let's say, asymmetry between the roles that these institutions have been given and the instruments that they have been provided with. So, for instance, you can say that in relation, for instance, to some of the only way in which the international social agenda has been reflected, which is the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, that objective really lacks any counterpart in terms of the instrument that the United Nations has to make that those set of objectives effective. Then we have in many of these areas a fourth sort of issue which we will see is actually quite important for some of the main questions that we're going to ask ourselves today, which is what I can call the unsettled relation between globalization and the nation state. In a sense, we have been building an international system, not a transnational system of institutions. I mean, there are some cases in which a set of transnational institutions have been created, for instance, in Europe, with the European Union and the European Commission, which has a specific set of powers, which over all member states of the European Union. But aside from those limited examples, and probably aside from that specific example, we are building a system, an international system, that is a system based on nations, on nation states. Now, one of the very peculiar characteristics of that system is that nation states have been weakening at the same time. So we're building a system in which we still have a very unsettled relation between the international, the global order, and the nation state. And finally, and very importantly also, we still have a system in which developing countries have very limited voice and participation in decision making. A fact that is reflected in all the major fora, starting with the World Bank and the IMF, but going to many other institutions and even to the major, let's say the most powerful institution in the United Nations, which is the UN Security Council. Now, to understand what I mentioned first, which was the very uneven liberalization of markets, it's interesting to see, let's say, the global order, as many historians have seen it, as having gone through 3 different stages, and one intermediate stage between the first and the second, which was really the collapse of the first global order. So we have a first globalization, going, let's say, from 1870 to 1913, the collapse in the interwar period, then giving rise to a second phase of globalization from, let's say, the end of the Second World War to 1973, and then, let's say, the sort of process that we have been living through since the mid-1970s. Now, if we look at the last column here and compare with the previous ones, let's say that the very specific characteristics of the current system is the high capital mobility. So capital is very free to move among nations. And the third line, what I call extensive free trade. Now, In the first area, that is in relation to the capital mobility, we have a system which is very similar to the first globalization. In the third, in the area of trade, we have actually much more liberalized trade today than we ever had in history. It is not true that the first globalization was a world of free trade. There were agents of free trade, such as Great Britain, but there were also major protectionist nations, starting with the United States of America and going through continental Europe, and Latin America being, during that phase, very protectionist nations. So actually, the world of the first globalization was actually one of limited free trade. From that perspective, we certainly have today the most liberalized trade regime ever in history. Now, at the same time, you see that we have what I call growing and segmented labor mobility. By growing, we will see that, in fact, labor has become increasingly mobile after collapsing both in the interwar period and in the second globalization. There has been an extensive movement towards labor mobility, but it's still limited and, very importantly, segmented in a different way to the way it was segmented during the first globalization, where labor was probably more mobile than today. The segmentations that we have today are basically segmentations according to the skills of workers. So skilled workers are much more mobile than unskilled workers. Or to be precise, unskilled workers can only move largely in an irregular, or as it is said in the United States, in an illegal manner. I prefer the term irregular to illegal, because people are never illegal. Okay? So the irregular form in which labor mobility takes place. In the first globalization, it's interesting that the major forms of segmentation were according to the origin of migrants. So essentially, Asian migrants move in a different way from European migrants. While European migrants migrated to the United States, Canada, let's say Australia, New Zealand, or Argentina in a fairly free manner, Asians were generally forbidden at some point from migrating into those places. So that Asians really migrated to the tropics, basically in South Asia, to Africa, and to some tropical parts of Latin America and the Caribbean. Now, in terms of the last two issues, I would say that the essential characteristic of global institutions is, as I said, that they are lagging behind. That's a different characteristic, I think, from the second globalization and the first globalization. In the first globalization, we essentially had no major international institutions. In the second, there were the birth of some institutions which were not, very limited in scope. In the second institution, on the other hand, there was, at the end of the Second World War, a major effort to create new institutions, to manage a new global order, which was the origin of the United Nations, the origin of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, as well as many other institutions. Now, the institutions that we have today, in a sense, are the same that we inherited from the second globalization, but they have not adapted yet to the challenges that are posed by this third globalization. And finally, in terms of the national institutions, I would say that the main characteristics of this third globalization is what I call the growing standardization of institutions. There's a big difference to the previous two phases, in which it was openly recognized that national institutions could be very different from each other. So there was no attempt and no forces that generated a homogenization of institutions. Now, viewed from the point of view of the unequal distribution of benefits, what we have, let me go through the graphs, is first of all what I call has been called divergence big time. So a long-term divergence between industrial and developing countries that starts during the first globalization and has not yet stopped. In this graph, you can see particularly in the first, the white columns relate to the, let's say, the developing countries, while the blue columns relate to industrial countries. So in the first two periods, the first period, let's say, basically covers the first globalization, and the second covers the interwar period. Developing countries lag significantly behind. Now, that was somewhat counteracted during the second globalization. So generally, there was a big boom, also called by many people the golden age of post-war development, in which industrial countries grew very fast, and developing countries had the first boom ever in history. Now, in the succeeding phases, actually developing countries started to lag also behind, again behind, particularly those outside Asia. So you particularly see the black columns at the end basically relate to the growth of the average developing country. Very much less than the industrial countries, which are again in blue. So the result of that is that we have a long-term increase in international inequalities. This shows two measures of international inequalities in the post-war period until 2001. As we will see, the recent period is somewhat atypical in history. The red line shows the ratio between the per capita income of the OECD, that is the industrial economies, and sub-Saharan Africa. So there's the two extremes of the international distribution of income. As you can see, there has been a persistent increase in the gap between industrial economies and sub-Saharan Africa. Now, the blue shows the, let's say, the average developing country. So the story there is a bit different. As you can see, there has been also almost persistent increase in inequality with one exception, which is the period between 1973 and 1980. But aside from that, also the average developing country has lagged behind the industrial world. So viewed over long periods of time, as we saw in the previous graph, prior to 1950, there had been a significant divergence of income, and generally speaking, on average, there has also been an increase in divergence of incomes since the 1950 also. So the recent period, the period going particularly from 2004 to 2007, is actually the first period in which we see a very high advantage of developing countries. This is the first period in history, you can say, in which developing countries are growing significantly above industrial economies. Now, does this represent a break in history? May I say we don't know yet. It may. It may, particularly because China and India in particular have become engines of their own. And it may be that they can constitute an alternative engine of the world economy. But so far in history, that a sort of performance has not been evidenced for a long period of time. I guess we will see in the next crisis whether this is true or not, in particular. Now, viewed from the point of view of the distribution of benefits among citizens, not among nations, as in the previous graphs, what is striking is how much income distribution has become unequal throughout the whole world. Now, based on a study by the United Nations University, I estimate here, what is the percentage of the population of the world that lives in countries where income inequality has risen or has fallen, basically over the last 3 decades. And the conclusion is that 88% of the population of the world lives in countries where inequality is increasing. So increasing inequality within nations is even a more pervasive phenomenon, in a sense, than increasing inequality among nations. particularly because among nations, at least we have the opposite phenomenon of some major developing countries growing very fast. China, now over 25 years, and India in a shorter period of time. Now, on the contrary, according to these estimates, less than 3% of the population of the world live in countries where income distribution improved in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. So this is a very pervasive phenomenon that we see here in this next graph, in terms of the effects that has had on income inequality in the world. So while the income inequality of the world may have improved, particularly due to the rise of China in the world economy, at the same time, it is true that income inequality within countries has been an increasing source of world inequality since 1980 at least. Now, a third phenomenon that affects developing countries relate to some social issues, and I just mentioned 2 here. The first one is that the development of a social welfare state is highly associated with the income level of countries. So if we see here the spending, the social spending as a proportion of the size of the economies, we see that we have the 3 columns for low income, middle income, and high income countries. So the high income countries generally have a very sophisticated set of institutions to manage the effects of markets and to promote social development, while this is not true particularly of low-income countries. And many middle-income countries are really struggling to develop those institutions. So the capacity of nation-states to contract markets by themselves really depends on the level of income of countries. And the second, which is has many phases to it, but this is one phase, is the fact that the global economy has experienced major problems in terms of generating enough employment opportunities. So one of the phases of that problem in developing countries is what I call here rising labor market dualism. That is the growth of the informal relative to the formal economies. So the different precarious forms of employment that have been becoming increasingly common in the developing world, and which of course are forcing itself in other ways to generate an outflow of labor from the developing to the developed world, which we will see later in terms of graphs. You see here is the comparison of the 1980s in red with the 1990s in blue, and we see that while in the industrial countries, which is the second sort of graph, the informality has been declining slightly. In all regions of the developing world, it has been increasing or it increased in the 1990s. Now, how do I interpret these facts? So my interpretation of these facts, which you have in the reading from a book that I wrote some 4 years ago, is that we have to understand this, as I said in the beginning, as the result of some inequalities in the global order, which I call here the 3 basic asymmetries of the global order. Now, the 3 essential asymmetries, which are characteristic of this period, not necessarily of previous periods of globalization, are, first of all, the financial and macroeconomic asymmetries. Now, the financial and macroeconomic asymmetries, at the end of the day, relate to 2 fundamental facts. To the fundamental fact that the money of the world, the major monies of the world, are monies from industrial countries, not from developing countries. So the center of the global economy is the one that provides international currencies, particularly the US dollar. Now, that generates, through many mechanisms that I'm not going to explain, some 2 other problems. The first is the phenomenon of financial market segmentation. Financial markets discriminate between what they consider good borrowers and bad borrowers, or less risky and more risky borrowers. So that developing countries are usually classified in the category of riskier borrowers. And that generates, as we will see, a third problem, which is the difficulty that developing countries have to manage the very strong financial cycles that they face due to this phenomenon. So the first one is, in a sense, a problem that generates, in the terminology of economists, very pro-cyclical behavior. Developing countries are subject to strong business cycles and have very limited room of maneuver to manage those cycles. We will see that in some graphs and tables. The second, which has, I must say that first asymmetry is actually very characteristic of the current order. It was not characteristic of the first two globalizations. I will not explain that in detail. The second actually has been characteristic of all phases of globalization, and I call it the technological and productive asymmetries. Now, this problem relates to the fact that the major engine of world economic growth is technological change. But technological change is very highly concentrated in a few countries of the world. So in a few industrial economies, most of the new technologies are generated, and there is a very complex process by which that technology is disseminated throughout the world economic system. And that process, let me say, is not a smooth one. And requires that there is a continuous transfer of production activities towards the developing world, particularly primary sector activities and some manufacturing activities. And it's a process that does not work smoothly, among other reasons, because industrial countries protect those sectors which they should, are decaying in the industrial economies and should be transferred. But they try to avoid, the process due to many, internal pressures that they face, including the internal political pressures. And the third problem is the asymmetries in the degree of mobility of factors of production. And this issue relates in particular to the fact that capital is much more mobile than labor, and particularly than unskilled labor. Now, the major implication of that fact, as I think that particularly some of the work by Danny Roderick has shown, is that there is a bias in income distribution against the less mobile factors and in favor of the more mobile factors. So the tendency of world income to favor the more mobile factors, particularly capital and to some extent skilled labor, may be related to the fact that the international economy discriminates against labor mobility, and particularly against the mobility of unskilled labor. So let me go through some of the ways in which these asymmetries are manifested. This is the instability of finance for developing countries, particularly look at the line. This is the availability of finance for developing countries. You can see back there, the end of the boom of the 1970s, then the debt crisis, then the boom of the 1980s, which ended with the Asian crisis, and then the recent boom of financing. So now, of course, we are experiencing in the developing world a true flood of capital. But we experienced in the past other floods of capital. The problem is that the floods of capital are followed by very dry weather. So it's the instability of finance, the fact that we alternate between extremely good financing and the lack of financing that generates very strong swings in the developing world. And this is seen from the point of view of the cost of capital. So the periods of crisis are reflected here in peaks in the cost of financing. So if we combine the two graphs, we will see that the periods in which financing is available, the cost of financing falls. The periods in which financing is not available are periods in which financing becomes very expensive. So we alternate between periods in which financing is good and less available at very low cost, with periods in which it's not available, and whatever is available at very high cost. So it is particular swings in financing that are the manifestation of that first asymmetry that I was mentioning. Now this is one. So you say, well, why don't developing countries develop policy instruments to try to counter the cycle? Well, the point is they cannot. They generally cannot. They have very limited room of maneuver to do that. And one way to see that is this particular table, in which I estimate how cyclical is fiscal policy. And we see in the table, OECD countries have counter-cyclical fiscal policies. Though they tend to, that means that they tend to increase public sector spending during crisis and tend to moderate public sector spending during booms. So fiscal policy tends to smooth business cycles. In the developing world, the opposite is true. All regions of the developing world have either what I call moderately pro-cyclical policies. So, actually fiscal policy moves or reinforces the business cycle. And no region in the developing world has a counter-cyclical fiscal policy as the industrial countries. So these are manifestations of that. So the developing countries are subject to very strong cyclical swings in the international economy. And I think there is a lot of evidence it's a massive literature that actually has shown that business cycles have tended to become smoother in industrial countries. In the developing world, actually the evidence is the opposite, that business cycles have become sharper, more stronger. Now, one characteristic which I don't have time to dwell in is this very peculiar result in the post-Asian crisis, which is, is water flowing uphill. Finance, it was traditionally said, should flow from the industrial countries to the developing world. And that was supposed to be a way to smooth out, to reduce global inequalities. Well, the opposite is true. And it has been increasingly so since the Asian crisis. So the net transfer of resources from developing countries to the industrial world reached last year $800 billion. Now, the reason for that, I would say the basic reason for that, is that since developing countries have learned that they are subject to strong cycles of finance, they have decided to use the current good financial conditions to accumulate what has come to be called self-insurance. So they have been accumulating massive amount of international reserves to manage the next crisis. And the manifestation, one of the major manifestations of that, together, I guess, with other phenomena that I'm not going to explain, associated basically with high commodity prices. But the result of that is that, developing countries actually, instead of receiving net financing from the industrial countries, are actually financing the industrial countries, and particularly the United States. Now, in the trade area, I would say the major problem that we have is that the opportunities tend to be very unevenly distributed among the developing countries. I mean, there is, first of all, the only way in which, let's say, the technological transfer can be done smoothly from let's say, from the industrial country throughout the developing world is actually to have a parallel process by which economic activities are transferred. Now, that process has two problems. First of all, that the industrial countries tend to block that transfer by protecting basically agriculture and protecting some light manufacturers which are labor intensive. Okay, so that's one phenomenon. And the second phenomenon is that the opportunities to adopt particularly the manufacturing activities are not distributed evenly among the developing countries. So some developing countries which have already some level of development are much better at trying to attract those activities than the average developing countries. So for all developing countries, there are always some opportunities, particularly the opportunities to produce primary goods, but the opportunities to produce manufactures are not evenly distributed among the developing countries. Now, the result is important because, as you can see here, there is a strong evidence that the developing countries that are able to industrialize, and particularly in recent periods to industrialize towards high-tech manufacturers, do much better in terms of economic growth than those developing countries that are unable to do so. So the columns on the left, I mean, you have two columns here, what happened between 1962 and 1980, and then from what happened between 1980 and 2000. And what you see here is that in the earlier periods of time, in all periods of time, the countries that are basically specialized in primary commodity or in natural resource-based manufacturers, that is manufacturers based on the processing of natural resources, those countries tend to grow much less than countries that industrialize. And in the recent period, it's basically countries that move into high-tech manufacturers that can grow relatively fast. Now, again, this has changed during the recent period of time, basically because natural resources have become an opportunity again, for many developing countries. So in the recent period, the story, is slightly different to this. But over, long period of time, it is basically the opportunity to industrialize that has become an opportunity. Now, that opportunity has not been available to all developing countries, and particularly low-income countries have fallen behind in that process. And finally, looking at my third asymmetry, this graph shows that in many ways migration remains more limited than during the first globalization. So I have here the number of migrants as a proportion of total population at different points in history. 1910, 30, 60, and 2000. What you see here, are basically two phenomena. Aside from Western Europe, Western Europe was a source of migration in let's say in the late 19th century and early 20th century, and has only become a source of immigration in recent decades. So aside from Western Europe, actually the number of migrants as a proportion of the total population remains today below the levels reached in 1910. That is first characteristic of the traditional countries of immigration. This means the US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. This basically the pattern of the US, so a significant fall in the proportion of migrants from 1910 to 1960, and then a recovery to levels which remain significantly below 1910. But it's also, and very much so, the characteristic of the other destination of European migrants in the late 19th and early 20th century, which was South America, so Argentina and Uruguay. So then we see just a collapse. As you can see, the proportion of migrants in Argentina and Uruguay was much higher than the US, let's say, in the first globalization. So overall, yes, there is this increasing mobility of labor, but the proportion of migrants remain below what had. Actually, you estimate it not in this way by looking at a specific moment of time, but actually by looking at periods and the contribution of migration to population growth. You will find out actually that migration was much more important in the first globalization than it is today. Now, with this background in mind, let me try to reflect on what should be the sort of objectives of international cooperation and some of the issues of international cooperation. So I define in my work what I call the three basic objectives of international cooperation, which relate to different aspects of the interdependence, but which is characteristic of the global order. But the first objective is the management of interdependence as such. And this has to do with what we economists have called the supply of global public goods. Now, global public goods are basically goods that are provided to manage interdependence. Interdependence associated, for instance, to the economy, for instance, to the macroeconomy, to the financial cycles and and macroeconomic cycles in general, to trade. So you have to provide some institutions to coordinate global trade, particularly the WTO in recent periods. But also to other issues, let's say environmental issues have become increasingly important as global public goods. So the management of climate change can be considered to be one of the issues of global public goods. Now, aside from the issue of interdependence, there are, however, two other issues which I call the issue of the equality of nations and the issue of equality of citizens. Now, the issue of equality of nations, respond to to what I have presented today. The fact that nations are very let's say are part of a hierarchical system. So they are really unequal. The opportunities that they face are very unequal. And they are particularly unequal according to the level of development. So low-income countries generally have much more difficulties than middle-income countries in relating to the global economy, and say middle-income countries in turn have much more difficulties than the high-income countries in relating to the global economy. So these issues basically relate to how to overcome the asymmetries of the global order that I mentioned before. That is the macro, the technological, and the inequalities in the mobility of factors of production. And the third issue relates at the end to how we transplant to the global order what was the origin of the nation state, or the modern nation state, which is the equality of citizens. That is how we built an international system of, let's say, of rights, which is, let's say, the best expression of the citizens, the fact that the citizen has rights and is equal to others insofar as she or he has rights, that, and how that agenda of the equality of citizens is transplanted to the world economy. So in this regard, we are concerned not only with citizens of developing countries, but also even with citizens of industrial countries, which may be unfairly treated by the global economic order. So how to manage that, they say, the losers of globalization as individuals or as families, which may be located any part of the global economy. I would probably argue more frequently in developing countries, but also in industrial countries. Now, so we will see several issues of the international agenda that reflect to some extent different parts of these objectives. Some may combine the first two, others may relate to the third, as we will see. Now, before I do that, however, it is actually interesting, and going back to my first presentation about the problems with institutions, that what is the sort of governance structures that that we should build? And I would say those governance structures have to respond to the heterogeneity of the system. And though there is first a question of the relation between the global and the regional and sub-regional institutions. So my first point is that a system built on a denser network of institutions is preferable to a system based on few institutions because of the heterogeneity of the system. So that's why there is a role here, and a significant role for regional and sub-regional institutions, and also for national institutions. So it has to be a system that takes into account the different orders and the heterogeneity of that order, and that denser system is likely to be better to manage the global order than just having a few international institutions. So this is not, it's not a question in that regard of building one big nation, they say global state. It's really of building a network of institutions that perform the functions of the state. Now, insofar as the system is international, that is, and by that I mean based on nation states, there are some very specific characteristics of what is allowed for nation states. And in that regard, there are two particular questions, or two particular issues, excuse me. The first one is what, particularly in the United Nations debate, has come to be called the policy space. So nation states have to be allowed sufficient space to manage the effects that globalization has on their citizens. And the second is that the responses in a democratic order are not necessarily going to be the same in different nations. So a second characteristic of of that order has to be that global institutions should be firmly respectful of diversity. Okay? And I'll actually finish with that specific point. And the third problem in the governance structures that we know today is the fact that the participation of developing countries is unequitable. It's unequitable particularly in the powerful institutions, and it's actually non-existent in some institutions. I mean, it's unequitable in the Security Council of the United Nations. It's unequitable in the IMF and the World Bank. They have been discussing that issue. But it's even more inequitable in other institutions, such as the Bank of International Settlements. And it's non-existent in some areas. For instance, in the design of global financial rules or global accounting standards, there is absolutely no participation of any developing country. So there is a basic problem of what in UN jargon came to be called the voice and participation of developing countries in decision making. So these are different issues that we see in the global order today. Now, with that in mind, particularly taking in mind the three basic objectives of international cooperation, let me reflect on some of the areas of international cooperation. So let me start with macroeconomic and finance. I mean, what are we talking about? I say, well, there are some issues that relate to the provision of global public goods, and the second set of issues that relate to the asymmetries, to that macroeconomic and financial asymmetries that we saw before. So in relation to the first problem, we need a system that provides some macroeconomic coherence in the world economy. We don't have one. And we're seeing that issue today. In the past, this was always solved through ad hoc arrangements among major powers. So there was a big crisis in the 1980s. There was the Plaza Accord, among the major countries to see how to manage, in particular, the issue of US deficits. Now, we're seeing today, and there is the attempt of International Monetary Fund in recent years to act, in a sense, in that character, now including other major countries which come from the developing world, particularly China and the oil-producing countries. Now, but that system is extremely dysfunctional today, so we have absolutely no mechanism in the world to guarantee that macroeconomic policies among major countries are consistent among each other. So there may be significant crises associated to that, and actually we are facing cyclical problems. We have faced cyclical problems in the 1980s and today, basically associated to the imbalances of the US economy. But the second issue is financial regulation. There is clearly an under-regulation of finance, which has become actually quite evident in recent months, in the financial crisis of the United States. Certain activities, such as the hedge funds and others, are unregulated, and there are many instruments available in the market that generate a lot of risk, which are not either subject to much regulation. So those are issues of the provision of global public goods. The international economy still lacks a system for macroeconomic coherence, and it still lacks a good system for financial regulation of the increasingly globalized world of finance. But there are also a sort of problems associated to the particular vulnerabilities of developing countries that relate to the availability of finance for poor countries. This is an area in which there has been advance in recent years. Official development assistance has been growing. I wanted to have a graph, but it was not very much up to date, so I didn't include it here. But there is clearly in the last 4 years a very large increase in financing. It still is highly insufficient for meeting some of the major challenges of poor countries. A second issue is the issue of availability of financing during crisis. Now, the International Monetary Fund was created for that purpose, but it has been subject to high levels of criticism due to the way it has provided finance in a very conditional manner, and in a manner which most developing countries consider to be highly unsatisfactory. So this issue is again in the international agenda. Then we have more broadly in the issue that we lack a global financial safety net. For many years, particularly since the crisis in the 1930s, industrial countries, or actually at the national level, all countries develop a financial safety net. Financial safety net is basically a way to manage the crisis of major financial institutions. Now, that is provided by the central banks in countries. There is nothing like that in the international economy. And also national systems have bankruptcy procedures, ways of managing, in a legal order, the bankruptcies. There is nothing like that in the global economy. So there are many issues, and that, of course, is particular issue of particular interest because it is developing countries of different character that have had, some crisis. So the only solutions have been of an ad hoc character to manage, debt. Ad hoc character such as the Brady Plan, which was designed in the late 90s for managing, the Latin American debt crisis, or the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, which was designed, about 10 years ago to manage the crisis of the poor countries. But there is no regular mechanism, there is no institutional mechanism in place to manage, crisis. Now, a second set of issues relate to trade. Now, in trade, we do have, the form of the global public good. That is a system of regulations for world trade, which is the World Trade Organization. But there are significant problems associated to the rules as they relate to developing countries. And these are issues, some of which have been emphasized by the developing countries in the 1960s. Others are of more recent origin. The first issue is the constraints on development posed by intellectual property rights. Now, since technology originates essentially in industrial countries, and the fact that that activity is highly protected by international regulation has become an increasing source of concern. In a sense, many developing countries in the past, and even industrial countries, developed by intellectual piracy of some sort, to use the current terminology. That is, by copying technology developed before. You can say that continental Europe, to a large extent benefited from that. Japan certainly benefited from the possibility of copying technology, and some of the originally Asian tigers also, and Latin American industrialization from the 1950s to the 1970s benefited a lot by copying technology. Now that is much more limited today in the World Trade Organization, And the cost of technology has become an increasing source of constraint for developing countries. The second issue, as I mentioned, the only way to transfer knowledge in technology in the world is to transfer economic activities. Now, that is blocked in different ways. So there are another set of issues associated to that, which are agricultural subsidies, the issues called tariff escalation and protection for labor-intensive manufacture. This relates to the fact that the more processed a good is, the higher the tariff it faces when traded with industrial countries. That's tariff escalation. And the protection of labor-intensive manufacturers, the fact that the more labor-intensive manufacturers, such as apparel, leather goods, etc., are subject also to higher levels of protection in industrial countries. And the third issue is in a world which is moving increasingly to a trade of services. It is quite clear that the services in which developing countries have potentially a stronger advantage, which are unskilled labor-intensive services, where these are basically tourist services, it can be construction services. Those services are not allowed to be provided internationally. That is, for instance, you cannot, for instance, design a construction company, in a low-income country that is able to bring its workforce, in industrial economy to do construction. That is not generally allowed in the world today. On the contrary, you have a financial service or a telecommunication service. You are allowed to enter your labor force, which is generally skilled, into a developing country. So there is a very uneven liberalization of services associated to that fact. And the final point has to do with an old issue, which is the room of maneuver for active production sector strategies. Now, as the reading from Ha-Joon Chang that you have shows, in the past, it was quite common to use protection or subsidies of different sort to industrialize. Now, with the current World Trade Organization, the room to do that has been significantly constrained. Now, in the global environmental area, I will just mention, there are many, many issues that relate to this is essentially a global public good issue. So, it is quite clear that the issue of climate change, the issue of biodiversity in particular are, essentially global, issues of global provision of global public goods. At the same time, however, there are significant problems of how developing countries relate to that agenda. Now, insofar as the source of emission of greenhouse gases has essentially come historically from industrial countries, the developing countries have been posing the question of how the cost of combating climate change is going to be distributed among countries. And in other areas such as forests or biodiversity, the major issue is the fact that the major sources of biodiversity and forests are now in the developing world. So if we want to protect those natural resources, what are the international transfers that will make that possible? Now, a fourth set of issues relate to the, what you can say is the lack of a global social agenda. In the institutions that we have developed for international cooperation, some issues of economic character are clearly there, such as finance and trade. Some issues of environmental character have become increasingly an agenda. The social agenda almost has no institutions, or rather has institutions that are very weak in their capacity to influence. There are many United Nations institutions that you can say, International Labour Organization and UNICEF, et cetera, that have, were created for this purpose. But the instruments that they have are extremely limited relative to the challenge that the world economy has in this area. So I would say that the seeds of a truly international global social agenda have only come relatively late with the Millennium Declaration and the Millennium Development Goals. But however, we have no institutions that will guarantee the provision of those or the achievement of those Millennium Development Goals. That is, we don't have a well-designed system of official development cooperation that is multilateral in character, that has, in which the recipients have rights, which is very different from, let's say, what happens at the national level. Backward regions generally have a right to transfers that have been designed by policies. And, and poor citizens have generally have some rights in terms of the systems by which they are protected. And more broadly, all the social protection systems remain in the domain of nation states. And we have still no global institutions to see how, how we encourage the development of social protection systems and how those social protection systems are made to interact with each other on countries on taxation. So there has to be, the coordination of global taxation has become increasingly a global public good. If we don't design systems of cooperation, competition, to reduce tax rates to attract investment may actually reduce the sources of financing for social protection systems, which are increasingly required for a global economy that generates risk. We have no rules to manage global competition. Antitrust regulations were, designed particularly under the leadership of the United States, since early in the 20th century to manage the problem, they say the uncompetitive practices of some firms. There is no system to manage the uncompetitive practices of multinational firms in the global economy. There is no mechanism to facilitate technology transfer. If anything, we have now in place a system that constrains technology or make costly technology transfer. And finally, there is no compensatory mechanism to facilitate the convergence of countries that lag behind in the global economy. Now, in countries, just to mention that, there have always been systems to transfer fiscal resources to the less developed regions of the country. And the European Union established that for the European Union. So, regions that are lagging behind, that have low incomes per capita, have access to a special financing, that helps to accelerate the development. There is nothing like that in the global economy. So, the global agenda, in other words, have incomplete elements and absent elements. But we do have a huge agenda in front to design a system in which the institutional development is compatible to the growth of global markets. And finally, let me say that whatever system we design, we have to always have in mind that the nation state is going to be at the center, and the nation state will be, for a long time to come, the major place where democracy plays a role. So an international system has to be firmly respectful of diversity and firmly respectful of the fact that there is no universal path to development and that the choice of citizens, or rather that citizens should have a choice over the economic and social institutions that they have in their own countries. Okay, thank you very much.